Okay, in this little unit, we're going to focus on the balance sheet. We're going to take the balance sheet and create two little sub-balance sheets for use in subsequent analyses and ratios. Okay, but let's start with the balance sheet as we know. So we have our assets. You subtract out your liabilities, and that equals your owner's equity. We learned this in our Intro to Accounting class, okay, the balance sheet. Now when you dive into the balance sheet, you'll remember that the assets are ordered in a certain way, with current assets at the top, non-current assets following. Okay? Same with our liabilities. We have our current liabilities and then our long-term liabilities. And then we have our owner's equity. So in the current balance sheet, things are separated. The laundry is separated sort of by time, short-term or current versus long-term. That's fine, but not as useful for what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is take this balance sheet and create two sub-balance sheets, one related to our operating activities, and that's going to be, we're going to use the color black for that, and then another balance sheet that's focused on non-operating activities, and we're going to use the color blue to just keep things separate. And we'll keep these colors consistent throughout these lectures. Okay? So let's start with our operating balance sheet. What we're going to do is go into the assets and identify all of the operating assets. So what do I mean by operating assets? These are the assets that arise and are used in the normal course of business operations. So think inventory, accounts receivable, our property, our plant, our equipment, our intangibles, so things like patents, even goodwill. Okay, these are assets that we use to do the business that we do. Okay. We're going to pull those out. We're going to call this operating assets, or OA, or operating assets. And then we're going to subtract from that our operating liabilities. So what are these? These are the obligations that arise in the normal course of business operations. Think accounts payable, wages payable, accrued liabilities, unearned revenue, those types of things. Okay. Now when we subtract these two, we might be tempted to call this thing our operating owner's equity. But that just sounds weird. There's just something that feels wrong about that. So it has a different name. We call it the net operating assets, NOA. Net operating assets, or NOA. So here we have a nice little balance sheet just focused on our operating assets and liabilities. Okay, let's move over to our non-operating balance sheet, and it's everything that's left. So we have some non-operating assets. You might think, what are those? Well, these are our investments. Companies make investments in securities. They make investments in other companies. If we're a company like Nike, we're not in the business of making investments. We're not a financial institution. But when they have some cash, they can invest it in securities, make a return. So we have our non-operating assets. We then have our non-operating obligations. So what are these? Well, quite simply, it's debt. Non-operating obligations are things that are debt. Notes payable, bonds, debentures, bank loans, capital leases or finance leases. We call them finance leases now. Leases with an interest component. That's our debt. Okay. So if you look at this sort of relates to our investing activities. The investments we make. The non-operating obligations relate to financing. Debt financing. And then here we have our operating piece. Operating piece, investing piece, finance piece. Okay. Now, in the non-operating balance sheet, we're going to do the math a little different. Okay, we're going to actually start with our non-operating obligations, and we're going to subtract from it our non-operating assets. So we're going to do the math this way, and we're going to get something we call NNO, which is net non-operating obligations. Okay, NNO, net non-operating obligations. Now, if we keep everything tidy, if everybody You know, if everyone in our balance sheet has a place, and it should, each item should have a place in one of these two, then the following identity will hold down here. I'll just kind of put this down here. Okay, we should find that our net operating assets, okay, minus our net non-operating obligations, that should equal our owner's equity. Okay, everybody's got a place. You know, everybody in the balance sheet has a place at one of these two tables. Okay, now we got to do one more thing before we move on to the income statement. When we think about net non-operating obligations, we need to think about the idea that there are two types of companies. Some companies are going to have more debt than investments. We're going to call those net borrowers. Other companies are going to have more investments than debt. We're going to call those net investors. That's just like people, right? Some of us on net, we've got more borrowing than we have investments, and others have more investments than we borrow. Well, it's the same with companies, okay? So what we're going to find is when we have to sort of identify, we have to make a clear distinction here. When NNO is positive, it's positive when the debt, a company has more debt than investments. That's when we're going to call this a net borrower. Okay. And when NNO is negative, well, that is when we have a net investor. Okay. Now, for now, that won't perhaps mean a lot to you, but it will later. When we start analyzing ratios, it's going to be important that you know if you're analyzing a net borrower versus a net investor. Okay. With that, we're ready to move on to the income statement.